I'm Frank Wright, and I was stationed in the Presidio of Monterey during World War II with Ed Ricketts, marine biologist, all-around great guy, great friend of John Steinbeck, not me, Ed was. I never met Steinbeck, but I worked with Ed Ricketts at the Presidio for 2.5 years. And after he was discharged for being over age, he was 47. He was a veteran of World War I. I was about 25, I guess, at that time. Ed Ricketts was University of Chicago and finished enough courses to feel that he could become a marine biologist. And a friend of his struck out for the coast and opened up a biological supply house in Pacific Grove. His friend had dropped out, and Ed continued in Monterey. His lab was on Cannery Row at number 800. Well, of course, it wasn't Cannery Row in those days. It was Ocean View Avenue. And that connected with Ocean View Boulevard in Pacific Grove. I got to know Ed very well. We had mutual friends. I was invited down to Ed's lab. The first week I was in the Army, it was a little scary doing that because neither one of us had a pass. And in those days, if you didn't have a pass when you were off the post, well, you were subject to court-martial. It was serious. And you must always remember one thing in the Army: MPs have no sense of humor. And nobody was laughing, but we never got caught. And we walked from the Presidio. The front gate was heavily armed, and so we went out the gate at Pine Street. There used to be a wonderful restaurant there, which is now just a house. It served best hamburgers in town and a beer, 25 cents. Boyd, Huff, and I were hustled on down to Cannery Row. It was a pretty nice walk, but it was a September evening. And we knocked at the door at number 800, and Ed answered. He was surprised to see us, but he was very hospitable. He asked us in. So we went in. None of us had any money in those days. I was a private, made $50. Boyd Huff was a sergeant. He made $55, I think, or $60. And Ed would have made about $55 a month. So you see, we were in the chips. And that's all we could afford, a beer and chips. We went across the street to the Wing Chong market. It was called Wing Chong in Cannery Row, but the old Chinese gentleman that ran it was Lee Chong. I was astounded when I walked into the store to find that they had firecrackers for sale, Christmas lights, Halloween masks, for sale all year round. They also had a meat market, vegetables, everything under the sun. Steinbeck in Cannery Row describes the store as not a model of neatness, but a miracle of supply. If you want to check that, that's page 9. We bought a couple of bottles of Burgermeister beer, 35 cents a piece. That was for a double bottle. A couple of bags of potato chips, this big, for 10 cents each. And went back over and ate the chips and drank the beer. But that was the first time I had been at 800 Cannery Row. I never dreamed I would be one of the owners of it many, many years later. But my friendship with Ed was remarkable. He was easy to know. He was a great guy, a great host. Very cool, very calm. Soft-spoken. He spoke with actually a hint of Midwestern accent, in that his voice was a little dry, I might describe it. He was 5'7". I remember him as being 10 feet 8. He sometimes invited us to dinner. One night I found him, I should say he found me, and said, "Oh, Frank, I've been looking all over for you." And he said, "We have Haliotis rubescens for dinner tonight. Won't you come down to dinner?" And he said, "Be there about 6. Well, I had been a zoology student, and I knew that Haliotis rubescens was the red abalone. He said, "I'll let you be the guy that tenderizes it with a mallet." He had a wonderful mallet with a face that had all kinds of nubbly things on it. And so I had to beat this. You actually, in abalone, it's all muscle. And if you don't take care of it by whacking it with a mallet, it's inedible. But you can break up the fibers a little bit. As a matter of fact, you break them up a lot. And then Ed would dip it in an egg batter, and I think he used cornmeal. And the slices were this big. The shell on the abalone was this big and red. And I want to tell you, that was one tender Haliotis rubescens when I got through with it. And after Ed had finished it, it was delicious. I wish you were here to do another one. I knew he was one in a million. He had written a book with Steinbeck. It was up on his shelf in the lab at the Presidio. The lab that he had was just about 3 or 4 feet square. It was nothing more than a closet in this building that was the medical building. He also had a copy of Between Pacific Tides, which was published by Stanford Press. You probably know that he had great difficulty publishing it because he didn't have a college degree, especially he didn't have a PhD. He had dropped out of school, I think, after just maybe 3 or 4 semesters. And that was the most of his education. Stanford loved the book, but they were afraid to publish it without the screen credits of the PhD. So they delayed and delayed and delayed. Steinbeck urged Stanford to publish it and wrote glowing letters. They finally did. I don't know if you know, but it was the all-time bestseller that Stanford Press has ever had. To this day, it is the bestseller. The book has a different concept in zoology and in marine biology. The book is incredible. Ed's first edition, which I recently just gave away to a marine biologist as a gift, had every chapter began with page 1. Every chapter was headed with a Roman numeral. And if you looked in the index for something like Haliotis, you might find it would be under maybe L, page 9. I'm making that up. You'd have to thumb through the book to finally get to L. Another marine biologist revised it and gave it a better index and redid the pages so that it wasn't so idiotic. When I was first at Cal in Berkeley in zoology, in first semester in 1938, we used that as a reference book, not a textbook. That was when I learned about his unbelievably inconvenient way of constructing a book. To him, it was not difficult. To anybody else, it was impossible. It's a great book, wonderfully illustrated by the photographer Jack Calvin, who did not write any of the text, but he did do all of the photos and all of the illustration. I got that straight from Ed on what Calvin's participation was. We were all in the Army and all wearing olive drab uniforms that were ugly as hell, and we all shared the problems of unhappy officers. Officers are never happy. They are always glum. As enlisted men, we did our part. But We processed 6,000 troops a day. About, that's total in and out in those days. We were called the reception center. At the Presidio, this is where your induction station would send you and you'd get your uniform. We were interviewed, classified, and a report was sent to Fort Douglas, Utah, which was our Corps headquarters. Ed did the shots and other things at the medical department, and I worked in the classification and assignment section. Ed could do anything. He may have been a marine biologist, but he could do blood typing, blood counts, give shots. He was good for free medical advice, free love life advice. There was always somebody complaining about something, but he always had an answer. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He always loved a good gag, but he was very witty, very charming, fun guy to be around. The Army gets a urine sample every time you turn around, I think. The induction station certainly had done that. I can remember in San Francisco, after they had taken my urine sample, they promptly spilled it. And the guy said, "Oh, that's all right, forget it." So that took care of the induction station. But when I got down to Presidio, Monterey, Ed ran every one of these samples. And it might be as many as 3,000 a day. We processed about 5,000, but this is 2,500 in, 3,000 in, 3,000 out, 5,000 to 6,000. It depended. We had to work 7 to 8 days a week. I think it was 9 days a week. We felt that we were on the 28-hour day. We really worked very, very hard handling all of this stuff. But Ed did every one, and occasionally picked up some cases of diabetes. There was a school teacher named Harlon Watkins who came to Monterey with the idea that he would like to teach math. He was a graduate of UCLA in math. He did calculus problems for fun. I walked in on him one time and he had a workbook open, and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Oh God, let me read you this problem." And he had the solution, and he was so pleased with himself because calculus was more than just another branch of math. To him, it was fun. Harlan and a friend was driving down Cannery Row, and he spotted this old building, 800 Cannery Row, and he saw a sign on the garage that said "for rent." Phone number. So he phoned it, and it turned out to be Yock Yee. That's Y-O-C-K-E, otherwise known as Jack Yee, who, along with a chap named Lundy, owned the Hoofden Cannery. When Harlan contacted Yock Yee about this, he said, "Oh, you didn't understand. Only the garage is for rent. Nobody could live in that place. It is a mess." And Harlan said, "Well, isn't that where Ed Ricketts, the marine biologist, used to live?" And he said, "Yes, but you don't want to see it." Harlan said, "Yep, I got to see it." So Yock Yee caved in and took him through the place, and Harlan fell in love with it. He said, "I'd like to rent it. I'll clean it up." And he did. And he lived there. I might tell you that he did not teach math at Monterey High School. They didn't have an opening. They had a math teacher who was very good. He said, "Well, what other departments need a teacher? How about English?" He said, "Sure. Can you teach English?" He said, "You bet." I think Harlan would have answered yes to anything because he wanted to live in Monterey very badly. He turned out to be a very inspired and inspiring teacher of English. I doubt if Monterey High has ever had a phenomenon like this before or since. He was incredible. He began a reading Catcher in the Rye, Salinger, which was quite a popular book in those days. And second, they would read Cannery Row. Harlon was already living on the row, so he would invite students down in small groups, and they would read Cannery Row together, certain sections, particularly the intriguing opening. Harlon loved it. But he had been married. He was about 42 years old, and he had been married, and he was getting married again, and his new wife did not want to live on Cannery Row. Cannery Row in those days was not like anything you see today. It was deserted. Weeds were growing in the street. The sidewalk in front of the lab was non-existent. It was tar, a broken down curb of wood, and dandelions growing in every possible place. The only business on Cannery Row that was doing anything was one cannery way down the street towards Monterey, and ultimately a restaurant. Neil Devon's restaurant went in. When Harlon decided that his wife didn't want to live in this wonderful old shack, he suggested to a group of us that we form a club, which we did about 1955 or 6. Harlon came to town in 55. I came back to town in 55. And we got to know each other at lunch, and through the association and friendship of half a dozen other guys, we had formed a club. Very loose. We didn't have a president, we had a king. And the king was Harlon. And we said, Harlon, you run it, you make all the decisions. We don't want to hear anything about it. We'll just have a beer and some chips. It started off as 7, which was a group that happened to be at Bill Stewart's house, the attorney. It was then decided that they would do a club. But where was Frank? Well, I wasn't there. And Eldon Dedini was not there. We were part of the group, but we weren't there for the original 7. And at the next Wednesday that came along, they voted Eldon Dedini in. Eldon Dedini, as you know, was a cartoonist for New Yorker magazine and Playboy magazine. He was one of their principal cartoonists, very gifted and brilliant artist. And the following week, why, they rounded me up and I was back in town. They said, well, Frank, we want you in the club. So Eldon and I became their new members. They didn't add any more for a long time. We were 9. The club rolled along. We rolled up finally to maybe 25 or 26, 27 members. And throughout the years, I'm sorry to say, they have died off. We're down to 4 now. I'm 1. And I'm still active. I'm 92. I might also tell you I have 20/30 vision. I have a little trouble hearing, but I'd rather see you than hear you. We don't meet as we used to with Wednesday night dinners. Judge Eldred, who was a new member, liked to cook, so he would prepare dinners. He was a fantastic cook. We had things like roast beef, leg of lamb, wonderful things to eat. Then we ate at the lab itself. That was as much fun as going to Neil Devon's, but we were great friends with Neil Devon and his staff, and we occasionally went down there anyway. The club was a great success. We were dedicated to doing nothing. We did not do fundraisers. We did not back local basketball teams, or we didn't root for a certain football team. We just minded our own business and had an awful lot of fun.